Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center. I'm delighted to welcome you today to this discussion about civil-military relations in the Trump administration. It's a fascinating time, question of who's in charge and how they're in charge. And in many ways, we're in uncharted territory. As everyone has noted, never before have we seen so many military men elevated to such heights across the executive branch. And, just yesterday we saw another one elevated. The president nominated the admiral who is his physician to be the head of the Veterans Administration. And that will provide for some really interesting nomination hearings, to be sure. We've never had a president, I think, who was quite so enamored of people with stars on their shoulders. On the other hand, on some issues, like the issue of transgender individuals serving in the military, I think it's safe to say that the president has driven those people he calls his generals pretty crazy. So it's a fluxy period. I would note that at the moment, the Department of Defense is an island of serenity compared with the rest of the agencies. But I think it's worth asking, is this good for the Republic, not good for the Republic, or very, very not good for the Republic? Well, today to discuss these issues, I'm delighted that we have Peter Feaver. He is the Alexander F. Haymeyer. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Are you still that?
That's a folding chair.
It's a folding chair. Well, he's that professor of political science and public policy at Duke, an institution that he has taught at since 1991, when he was about 9 years old. He is the director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies as well. He holds a doctorate from Harvard, and I'm delighted he's here because he is one of a rare breed of scholar practitioners who have gone through the revolving door into the White House. And in fact, he has done that twice, which is doubly unusual. Most recently, he was special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council staff from 2005 to 2007. Earlier, he was always referred to in the paper as Deputy National Security Advisor, so that's how I think of him. Earlier, as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, he worked as director in the Defense Policy and Arms Control Directorate of the Clinton NSC in 1993-94. He has written a number of books on civil-military relations, including Armed Servants, Agency Oversight, and Civil-Military Relations, published by Harvard. His most recent work was a co-written volume, Paying the Human Costs of War, which came out in 2009, was published by Princeton. Now, I should confess that I first met Peter floating in a pool, very comfortable pool in Aspen, Colorado. And like most people I've met under such circumstances, I thought he was a wonderful fellow. Sound opinions, shrewd thinker, happy contrarian, and keen analyst. I'm delighted to say that our relationship has survived getting out of the pool and that initial encounter. And I'm really pleased that he is here today to talk to us about these issues. So, Peter, with that, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you. So I'll mill about smartly here, if that's okay. But it's funny you mentioned that pool. We were in Aspen for the Aspen Strategy Group, and at that hotel was where they put the fellows who had brought their children. And so they had lots of the joys and delights of Aspen, and at great personal expense, I had brought my kids to this thing, all three of them, and it was a big hit to our family budget. And on our way back, I said, "So what did you love best about Aspen? Was it the mountains? Was it the ski lift?" And they said, "No, it was the hotel pool." And I said, "You're never coming back to Aspen. I'm not going to spend money for you to go take the hotel pool." But it is good to be here. I long admired the program here at Dartmouth. You guys have a very special concentration, one of the finest concentrations of scholars in security studies. in my area, and it's always great to come back and interact with them. My mission here is to convince you that civil-military relations American civil-military relations is a fascinating topic that you should have been studying your whole life, as I have, even before President Trump became president. But it's more interesting now. So I will try to talk a little bit about the challenges that we face in American civil-military relations, with a focus initially on what it was like before 2016, and then I'll talk about the things that have changed in 2016. The rate of change is so fast. I confess I did check Twitter right before I came on. There's no new news. The latest was the one that Dan reported that the VA secretary is out to be replaced by his personal assistant. The day before that, I checked, and the president was going to ask the DOD to pay for the wall with Mexico out of the DOD budget. And each one of these, in my little tribe of civil military scholars, we could have had a whole symposium on any one of these, and there's many more that I'll talk in a moment. So it's a really exciting time to be studying what I study. But it's always been an interesting time to study American civil mil. And the study of American civil mil, the issues there fall into two baskets. The first basket is a societal relations basket, the relationship between the military and the broader society. This is often called the 1% and the 99%. We have 1% serving, defending the other 99% who are not serving in uniform, sometimes called the civil-military gap. And this basket is framed by the following paradox, that public respect for the military, public confidence in the military as an institution is remarkably high. Remarkably for how long it's been high. Since the early Reagan years, there's been a supermajority of people who answer the poll, what's the institution in which you have the highest degree of confidence? They ask you about all these institutions, and the military keeps scoring high. So it's a long-standing support, but it's also remarkable because the public, you all, express low confidence in pretty much everything else. It's one of the few institutions that binds the American people together on the one hand, but the paradox is that the propensity to join the military keeps going down. So it's respect for the military, but it's respect at a position of remove. It's a respect for the other. Propensity to serve now is limited to a fairly, well, I'll ask you this. Do you know what is the marker that's the best predictor of whether you will accede into the military, whether you'll join as an enlisted or seek to become an officer? Whether your family members have served. If we were studying this in comparative politics, we would talk about this as a caste-based system of military accession. It's very unusual, and it's not at all what the American framers had in mind, or actually it's closer to what they worried about than what they had in mind, the framers of the Constitution. And so we have this paradox of societal military relations, high degree of professed respect, but low propensity to join, low levels of understanding of the military. And what are the problems that this can lead to? Well, on the one hand, it can lead to civilian alienation towards the military over time. Now, this might seem odd. Why do you say this? We have such a high degree of confidence and respect in the military. Even though that's been lasting for decades, it used to be the case when I started this gig. I used to say there's two institutions that the public has a high degree of public confidence in. I no longer have to say that. I only say there's one. What was the one that we used to have expressed confidence and don't anymore? The Supreme Court. And it dropped dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. Why? Well, there's writing a book right now to sort of tease this out, and the guy I'm co-authoring with disagrees with what I'm about to tell you. So a year from now, once we're done, I may come back and recant what I'm just about to tell you. But my hunch is that part of the story is that the Supreme Court and the military were perceived as nonpartisan institutions, that they just did their job. But over time, the Supreme Court came to look like 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 confused individual, a very partisan organization, as partisan as the House or Senate. Institutions that the public have very low degrees of confidence in. And so the Supreme Court over time has suffered from alienation of the public towards the institution. And people like the Supreme Court when it makes a judgment that they agree with, and they loathe the Supreme Court when it makes a judgment they disagree with. I think the military is at some risk, if it maintains this distance from the American public, of a similar kind of loss in respect if the military over time becomes viewed as a partisan institution. If the military increasingly takes on a politicized caste. And I've been writing and worrying about this for several decades now, where in the last, ever since the end of the Vietnam War and the shift to all-volunteer force and changes in the makeup of the Republican and Democratic Party, increasingly the military did start to look, or has started to look, like a Republican institution. It's more conservative. Members of the military are more conservative on average than the American people, and more Republican on average than their civilian counterparts. And you see a possible trend of a military looking more and more Republican, and thus becoming more and more perceived as partisan. There's some evidence of this even in that polling number that says a supermajority of Americans have confidence in the military. When you unpack that number and look at Republican versus Democrat, Republicans have an absurdly high, 90% confidence levels, and Democrats 50%. That averages out to the supermajority of confidence, but it suggests that there's a partisan dynamic at work underlying some of those levels of confidence. But there's also just a growing lack of understanding of the military. YouGov did a survey of the military a couple years ago for a project led by Corey Shockey and then a washed-up 4-star retired general named Jim Mattis, who was parked at Hoover Institute and doing academic stuff. So Corey Shockey and Jim Mattis did this study of American civil military attitudes and asked me and a team to look at the data to come up with some findings. And one of our findings was, compared to a similar survey that I had conducted 20 years earlier, the public is increasingly saying, I don't know, when asked about military questions. So they're giving, when they do answer, they give quote unquote wrong answers. You know, there's a textbook answer of what you're supposed to say on Civ Mil, and the public often gives the wrong answer. But more interesting to us was the growing number of don't knows, won't respond, refuse to respond, as if the public is saying, I don't even know or what to say in response to basic questions about civil-military relations. And so civilian alienation of the military is a problem. And when I speak to military officers about this, I point out one other way that civilian alienation might be a problem for them. And that is civilian willingness to fund military requirements. This may be an odd thing to worry about a week or so after we've just passed a massive defense increase. But that massive defense increase comes after several years of the sequester, which was a shocking development for the military. The idea that repeatedly, year in, year out, Congress, rather than authorizing and appropriating funds, would just allow an across-the-board cut to take place, a cut that was designed to be so stupid, so harmful, that it would never be done. The very threat of doing this would stop people from doing it, and yet Congress did it, and the American people didn't complain. And that was, that rattled the military. And if we had not had this plus-up, if we were left with the budget situation of President Trump's first year, we might be heading into some very fractious relations between civilian leaders and military leaders just on the level of budget. And I remind my military officers that I talk to that there's nothing more American than underfunding defense. There's a proud American tradition, or sorry American tradition, of underfunding the military. You build up this large military that wins the war, and then you demobilize it, send it home, and you're unready for the next one. And the quintessential illustration of this is Task Force Smith. A few short years after the U.S. produced the most powerful military in the world to win World War II, we deploy an under-armored, under-equipped, ill-trained task force to Korea, and it gets almost decimated. This is an American experience. Americans love their citizen soldier army, but have historically, over the course of the Republic, been skeptical about the professional military. So this is one possibility, civilian alienation towards the military. But there's the flip side of military alienation towards the public that can also come about from this paradox of societal military relations. A military that's been told you are the 1%, you are the best of the best, over time begins to believe it's the best of the best, which means the rest of us must be less than the best. And what do you think is the mindset of a military that has largely been shaped by 16 years of permanent war and 16 years of both parties outbidding each other to express confidence and love and affirmation for the military? 16 years of thank you for your service, 16 years of please take this upgrade and sit in first class, 16 years of this kind of affirmation can produce a sense of arrogance. And this is something that, that has reappeared during the 90s. There was the military writings of some that talked about how the military needed to save civilian society from the corruption of the Clinton administration and the decadence of civilian society. There's a concern that it could reemerge. So there's that paradox, or that level of dimension. And then the other societal dimension that this shows up in is the politicization of the military, dragging the military into our partisan squabbles. And whether you trace the modern era to 1988 or 1992, I think it's Admiral Crow's endorsement of Clinton in September 92 that was a defining turning point for this unseemly process of senior military officers being recruited to shill for candidates. It caught Bush 41 a little bit by surprise, and the Republicans made sure they would not be caught by surprise in 96, and so they massively retaliated with Colin Powell and Schwarzkopf, a major production in 96. 2000, it got even larger. 2004, you had scores of senior military endorsing both candidates. And this, of course, has the purpose from the campaign point of view of signaling to the American people, see, this guy is trusted by the military. By UCMJ, by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the active duty uniformed military can't express their preference. But if they could, they would say what this guy says. And I tell the generals that I'm teaching these modules to that the senior military leadership do not like this practice. And in fact, Admiral Mullen, General Dempsey, now General Dunford, have all indicated that this is not good. It politicizes the military. And I remind the generals that they're not really interested in your views, Paul Allen. They're interested in General Allen's views. It's not, your first name is Admiral or General. It's not your given name. You are chosen by the campaign because you represent the military. And so you are dragging the military into a partisan squabble. The military's respect is precisely because, or in part because, it's maybe has a non-partisan aspect to it, and you are soiling it. And so this escalation of partisanship in the military is something to be worried about. So everything I've just told you, I've been saying for decades and said loudly and longly up until 2016. What's happened since? Well, everything I just told you is worse now than it was in 2016. Even the politicization of the military in campaigns took a step downward in 2016. In sheer numbers, it was actually higher in 2012. So both Obama and Romney had been able to mobilize a longer list of generals and a more luminous list of names. I think there's the pushback by senior military to say we shouldn't be doing this is having its effect. But 2016 saw an escalation in another direction. The military were these retired military were front and center in the attack of the other candidate. That is to say, they weren't just saying, well, my candidate is strong on national defense. They were some of the lead attack dogs for saying the other candidate is unworthy. So John Allen, when he was on the Democratic floor, the nomination stage for the Democratic convention, made a withering critique of President Trump. And Mike Flynn, who played that role a couple weeks earlier for the Trump convention, was leading charge, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. This is an escalation of the politicization of the military. But you also see it in the degree to which particularly the president, I think it's more the president than his team, wraps himself in the military, claiming the military as an interest group that has, or a voting bloc, I should say, that has supported him, using the military as props for, not just for announcements on defense strategy, where it's perfectly legitimate to have the military as a prop. Parenthetically, if you're thinking like a staffer, why would you use the military as a prop? Because they'll show up when you tell them to. They will clap quietly and respectfully. There'll be no problem. So if you're just an advanced person planning an event, you would always want the military. But this administration has used the military as a prop for some of its more controversial partisan political actions. And the most egregiously, in my judgment, was the refugee ban. Whatever you think of the refugee ban, it shouldn't have been unveiled in the Pentagon when the president went to see Secretary Mattis. And as far as I can tell, Secretary Mattis did not know that was going to be revealed there. That's not, he thought he was getting a basic grip and grin kind of photo op, and they got this. So politicization in that. And then, of course, as Dan has already mentioned, the president has chosen the senior military for so many slots. Now, when this happened, it created a mini moment to be on TV for those of us who study civil mil. We're usually toiling in obscurity. No one wants to talk to us. But should we change the law to allow General Mattis to become Secretary Mattis? So several of us got a chance to testify or speak. Everyone was calling us for about 15 minutes. And there was a consensus, I think, across the board among my tribe that it was worth breaking the rule or making an exception for Secretary Mattis to be, for General Mattis to be Secretary Mattis. And I can talk in Q&A as to why the rule is a good rule, but why it also made sense to make an exception for Mattis. I supported H.R. McMaster as the replacement to Mike Flynn. I thought that was a pretty good choice. I think John Kelly has, on average, done better than Reince Priebus as Chief of Staff. So each one of these individual choices could be defended on its merits, but the cumulative effect of having so many military, and so many military with a very similar battle story. Kelly, Dunford, and Mattis all were in the same Marine unit in the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's remarkable. They're all within the same tiny subsection of the Marines, which itself is a tiny insular group. So it's a very small subset, and they are taking jobs that in the constitutional design were part of civilian control of the military, so it's concerning. And that brings us to the second basket of civil-military issues, which is civil-military interactions at the policymaking strategy level. So when you study civ-mil, some of us specialize on societal civ-mil, gap issues. Others of us specialize in the civil-military interaction at the senior level, deciding strategy. And in this basket, there's another, it's framed by another paradox. The paradox is the U.S. boasts an unbelievable record of civilian control of the military. It's a proud record. Few great powers can rival us. Such a long period without a successful coup, without even a real coup attempt. You have to get really into the weeds before you get even a rumor of a possible coup, and so nothing close to a coup attempt. It's a very proud record of civilian control on the one hand. On the other hand, every Secretary of Defense from Forrestal, the first one, through Ash Carter, Obama's last one, came into office, into the building, believing that they had to reassert civilian control, that under their predecessor, the civil-military relationship had gotten out of whack, out of balance, and the military had gotten too big for its britches and needed to be reined back in. This was Forrestal's view, and every Secretary of Defense since then has thought it. And it didn't matter whether there's a change in administration, a change in party. It's a remarkable record of civilian concern about civilian control and a remarkable record of civilian success at civilian control. What explains this paradox? One way you could explain the paradox is to say, well, we have such a good record of civilian control because we worry about it so much. And I think that actually is part of the story. I'm glad that people take civilian control of the military seriously in the United States. You could also say that there's a certain amount of marking one's territory, like the way the dogs come in and mark the territory, so a new Secretary of Defense comes in and pees in the corners of the general's offices to establish that he's boss. I think that's part of it. But the aspect of it that I think is worth emphasizing is competing expectations of how the relationship should go. That the friction that is endemic in American system derives heavily from competing expectations. And the analogy I use here with some trepidation, I've gotten away with it before I was videotaped. Now my wife might actually see it, and I will regret saying it, but it's marriage. Those of you who are married maybe can remember what you thought marriage was going to be like before you got married. And if you had interviewed your spouse and asked them what they thought marriage was going to be like, and in particular what they thought the other's role was going to be and the other's posture vis-a-vis you was going to be, it's likely that you would have entered into marriage, as I did, expecting one thing and then gloriously experiencing something else. And that's the same case with the civil-military relationship, that the military have an expectation of how this is going to go, how this marriage is going to go. And it's one that's framed and well captured. It's not just described, but I think it's influenced by Sam Huntington, who wrote Soldier in the States, still the most important book in American civil-military relations. And this book describes an ideal type relationship where the civilians set strategy and the military voluntarily subordinate themselves to civilian leadership on strategy. In exchange, the military gets a zone of autonomy where they and their expertise get to hold sway. It's a sharp division of labor. There are things that are civilian to decide whether to go to war, who to go to war against. And then there are things that are military to decide. Given that this is where we're going to go to war, here's how we should do it, and here's how the operations should go. As one general put it, civilians tell us where they want to drive the bus to, and they leave the driving to us. That this is the military expectation of the relationship. Huntington described this as the ideal way. This is how you'll get the best civil-military relations. Military have been trained in that, they expect it. That's not what civilians bring into the relationship. They expect something very different. They expect that there is no dividing line, that the dividing line between what is civilian to decide and the military to decide is what the civilians decide it is that day. And where that dividing line is can change from day to day or issue to issue, can change depending on what's on CNN that night. There are no rules of the game that the civilians have to follow. The rules of the game, and the game itself, is what the civilians say it is in that moment. It's a much more assertive, intrusive form of relationship. And it's captured in the work that I've done, and Elliot Cohen and Dick Kohn and a couple others who've argued whether or not this is the right way to do it, this is the way civilians expect. And you have that competing expectation then of military expecting one thing and continually disappointed by a civilian that interferes and micromanages. And civilians frustrated that the military don't get it and need to live with this way, and frustrated that they're being measured against this unrealistic standard. This is a pattern that repeats itself from administration to administration, and we reached arguably a high watermark of it in the Obama administration, where a White House that was very centrally controlling on strategy and policy down to operations, very much in the knickers of the military on operational questions, and a military very frustrated at the level of intrusive monitoring that the Obama White House, led by the NSC, was doing, and the decisions that they thought should be made at lower levels of military command were being drawn up in the subject of PCs. Now, this issue is compounded by a dialogue of the deaf, which might also work well from a marriage relationship, with two sides saying things and hearing something very different. The military, for instance, let me describe a crisis situation. There's something bad has happened around the world, and within seconds of finding out, the White House the NSC will call Joint Staff and say, we need options, give us options of what we can do in response to this situation. The Joint Staff will say, we can't give you options until you give us end states. Tell us what you want the end state to be, and then we will tell you what military options could be developed against that end state. The White House will say, we can't tell you what our end state, desired end state is until you tell us what your options are. We don't want to commit to an end state only to find out that that end state is going to cost 500,000 troops and 10 years of deployment. Then we don't want to be on record having endorsed that. So we want to see your options before we give you the end states. And the military will say, that's literally not how the process works. We cannot. The very first input into the military options generation machine is, give us the end states. And this is a dialogue of the deaf that goes past each other. Sometimes it's so bad, or so absurd, it's a dialogue of the deaf over simple communication. The story is told of the Obama team wrestling with a crisis on the Pakistan border. Pakistan had shut down the border because of a friendly fire incident, and the border was where all of the logistics and food and material to support the Afghan war was coming through. All of the US troops, all of NATO troops fed through the Pakistan border. And so the shutting of this border was a major, major issue, and it brought a principals committee meeting together to decide what to do. And the military explained that the Pakistanis have closed the GLOC, the ground lines of communication. They've closed the GLOC, and now we've got to figure out what to do. It was an hour-long meeting of great concern, some fuzziness on decisions made, but decisions were made. And after the meeting, my friend heard two senior cabinet-level officials say to each other, "What the hell is a GLOC?" They've just had an hour-long meeting where they made decisions about responding to the GLOC. They didn't know what the GLOC was. This is a simple communication failure of a military that speaks in jargon and a civilian that hears in normal English. All of these challenges are made more difficult by a normative framing that underlies American civil mil, and that is the democracy condition. Civilians have the right to be wrong. Civilians, at the end of the day, have the right to make a decision that may go poorly. And it is not the military's responsibility to prevent the civilians from making that decision. And the military wrestled with this. They struggled with it in the 90s when Clinton wanted to lift the ban on gays serving openly in the military, and the military said that's the wrong decision. And they took steps to try to complicate President Clinton's efforts. Similarly, President Bush wanting to do the surge in 2006, the military thinking that's the wrong idea, made it difficult initially for Bush to reach that decision. 2009, President Obama is trying to decide what to do in Afghanistan. Military think they know the right answer. Very frustrated that Obama kept leaning in the other direction. The right to be wrong is something that's difficult for the military to accept, but to a very great extent, and especially compared to other great powers, the military has accepted it. But this is what brings us now to what things have changed in the current era. Because in the Trump era, what we are seeing is discomfort in the principle of right to be wrong, not just amongst military, where it's always been, but now especially amongst civilians, particularly amongst those civilians who didn't vote for President Trump. There's an open discussion repeatedly in the commentary and op-eds and on TV and the cable news commentary of, well, thank goodness for Secretary Mattis, General Dunford. If the Trump White House wants to do something stupid, they will stop him. And indeed, in much of the questions about what is it going to be like when Bolton replaces H.R. McMaster was, will Bolton be able to ram things through on Mattis and Dunford, or will Mattis and Dunford be able to block Bolton and Trump? And the people who are saying, well, we're rooting for Dunford and Mattis to block it, are good old-fashioned classical liberal civilians who are saying, in this instance, we're a little bit nervous with the democracy condition of civilians have the right to be wrong. And where it shows up in especially acute area is in nuclear command and control. This is the often expressed as, well, if we can't stop President Trump from tweeting, how can we be confident we can stop him from nuking? And I heard Senator Markey in open hearing say exactly that question. He put that question to me. How can you stop President Trump from nuking if you can't stop him from tweeting? That puts in sharp relief the issue of right to be wrong. On this one issue, I believe I can offer some assurances. I'm a contrarian. I'm by nature a worrier on many areas. I think the worry on this narrow issue is perhaps greater than it needs to be. It's worth doing some worrying. It's not worth panicking and heading to the bomb shelter. Because there's an important difference between the way the nuclear command and control system works when the military wakes up the president versus how it works when the president wakes up the military. When the military wakes up the president, it's the middle of the night and there's a crisis around the world, they wake up the president and they say, Mr. President, you have the following situation. We need to know, do you give us the nuclear order? The situation is maybe North Korea is about to attack us with nuclear strike, and we have a limited window to catch their missiles before they have launched. So we can do a preemptive strike, but we have to decide right now. In that setting, the command and control system is highly streamlined, and if the president says, go nuke, I think the military will carry out that order. And the president by himself has the authority and the capacity to give the valid order that would then lead to a military strike. In that setting, you would get a nuclear bomb, a nuclear detonation at the end of it. In the other, though, where President Trump wakes up in the middle of the night and says, I'm really pissed off, it's time to do something different, but instead of tweeting, I'm going to try nuking. So President Trump wakes up the military and tries to execute a nuclear strike. Yes, he has constitutional authority to issue that order, but the nuclear command and control system is not primed in that setting to move rapidly. Instead, what it's primed to do is to ask the question, what are you trying to achieve, sir? What is your desired end state? Let's bring in Secretary Mattis to talk about this. Let's bring in Dunford. It would broaden the scope. And the command and control system that is primed to respond to the president's sole order in the first crisis would actually broaden, I believe, broaden the decision space, lengthen the decision time, and thus not respond. The president could fire off a tweet and not be stopped by his military advisors in that setting, but could not fire off a nuke in that setting. But President Trump has chosen lots of military and has had the consequence, and this is where I'll close and I'll bring up Dan for continued Q&A. It has weakened the civilian side in the following respect. I worry less about the military people he's chosen, and I worry more about the weakness in the State Department and the weakness in the functioning of the rest of the branches of government, the decline in congressional oversight, or the quality of congressional oversight, the decline of regular order authorizations, appropriations, which is where you work out the nitty-gritty of defense policy. Those things have declined, not all under President Trump. I think there's been a trend of it, but it's intensified. And that weakens the civilian side of civilian control. Where's the silver lining in that concern? We have a military that does spend a lot of time speaking and thinking about civil-military relations. I've now done a module more or less of the sort that I just did for you for thousands of military officers. All of the people at general and flag rank have gone through this module. The military, like other professions, takes seriously its relationship with its the customer it's serving, like lawyers or pastors who think carefully about their relationship. The military do. I'm dismayed that we civilians don't spend as much time doing that. I've spoken to thousands of military officers. Only once have I talked to civilian political appointees about civil-military relations like this. And I used to say, I've never talked to civilian political appointees, and that was my mic drop moment at the end of my talk to the military when I've got them all geared up, and I said, and I've never talked to your civilian leaders about this. And it's a aha moment for them. They have to take it seriously. Well, the good news is Secretary Mattis brought his team together, so 100 top civilian political appointees, to focus in on exactly these questions. And so I think there's a growing awareness among the civilian political leadership that they have to think long and hard about civil-military relations, as we have just done today. And that's, I think, a silver lining on what I said. So with that, I'll stop, and why don't we continue the conversation?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. That was terrific. Let's go back just for 1 second to the president waking up in the middle of the night, though. Since that is the scenario, I think, that haunts most of our sleep. So if he calls up Strategic Command and says, I've had it with those wacky North Koreans, let's do this. You think that the commander says back, sir, that would be aggression?
So first, the military is trained to resist illegal orders. Right. And so they would have to believe that the order, they would have to have assurance that the order is legal. Now, in that first setting, when they have already woken up the president and they believe that intelligence tells them they're in a preemptive strike situation, then the law is settled. U.S. law is settled. That's a legal order. And they would carry it.
Legal.
That is a legal order.
Right.
But a preventive war, which is the one you asked about, it's not settled law, and the military would have to get a legal opinion on that. And now, the Stratcom commander has his own lawyer there. DoD has its own lawyer. Every level
the president's having a hard time getting lawyers.
Yes,
I don't know if you noticed.
I've seen that, but the military is fully equipped with lawyers who would be weighing in on, is it legal to have a strike in this setting? Now, they might conclude that it is. There was a big debate about, is it legal to use, to invade Iraq in 2002, and over the course of 6-8 months, they concluded it was legal in 2003. They, meaning the US government, did. So I'm not saying they couldn't, at the end of a long period of time, reach the conclusion, yes, we can legally do a preventive nuclear strike on North Korea. It's possible. But could they reach that judgment in the middle of the night without alerting Mattis, without alerting the chief of staff, without bringing in the cabinet? That is the scenario that I think is fanciful. In that larger, slower model, there'd be ample opportunity for leaks, and this administration leaks. And so I think there'd be a lot more people who would be aware of it. They might still reach that conclusion, but it wouldn't be done in the heat of the moment with only the president weighing it. That's my judgment. I should hasten to add, that doesn't mean that there's nothing to improve on nuclear command and control. I think there's lots of things that we should do, and I'm in favor of some of the reforms that would lengthen the decision time the president has and better harden the system against, say, spoofing and cyber threats. So there's things we could do to improve it, but I'm less concerned about the idea of the president waking up in the middle of the night and going crazy.
In your history of civil-military relations, you focused on the well-known critique of the Obama administration, that it was too much in the military's business, and I'm not going to dispute that. But I'm curious where on the spectrum you put the secretary who I think acquired the reputation for being for having shifted the balance most, namely Rumsfeld, who bullied the hell out of generals right and left.
McNamara as well. So
yes,
exactly. No, Rumsfeld also was very intrusive, more in the first term than in the second term. He was a bit of the lion in winter by 2006, but he was absolutely in 2001 and 2002 and 2003 doing precisely these kinds of assertive civilian interventions that Elliot Cohen, Dick Cohen say, that's actually how civilians do it. Regardless of whether you say it's the right thing, that's what they expect to do. And the military should come to expect that that's what they're going to do, rather than keep holding civilians to a different standard. So was Rumsfeld worse than Susan Rice? Well, that's a question for the bar at Aspen Strategy Group. I think that that the military was especially frustrated with it in the Obama administration because because they felt, okay, we've learned several things. We've been at war for 5-10 years now, so we know some things. There can be more delegation down, and so I think it was they particularly chafed at it. But of course, the military also was very frustrated with Rumsfeld as well. So I think both of those led to high friction.
The one suggestion I would make or the addition I would make in viewing this tableau is that it wasn't just the military that felt like it was being told what to do.
Yes.
It was, all of the agencies felt that this was a very, very White House-centric administration. But we don't have to go any further into that.
Well, one of our mutual friends who had been a very senior official on the NSC staff under President Obama, and then a very senior official in the State Department staff afterwards, said, over time I came to realize just how pernicious those idiots in the White House were, having been frustrated by the idiots that he was dealing with in state. So
I want to ask you one more question on CivMil, and then I thought maybe I'd ask a few questions on how a distinguished member of the Republican foreign policy establishment who is not in this administration views how things are going. But the CivMil one, you talked about how the military can be alienated from the broader society. And I'm wondering if there isn't one other possibility, one other scenario for alienation that I think is worth worrying about, and that is the imbalance in terms of rewards for risks that the military goes through now compared to what we see among some of the peers of the people who are, say, attending West Point or Annapolis. In other words, you go to high school with someone, you go off to Annapolis, you're out there cruising the seas and possibly putting yourself in harm's way, and your classmate is participating in the sort of the greatest growth in wealth and of a particular class in American history. Is that causing real resentment in the military?
Yes, I do think that the military see the rich getting richer,
right,
and would like a piece of that. At the same time, though, they are serving at a time when military pay and benefits is vastly outpacing inflation over the last 20 years. And both parties are competing with who can outbid them in loving the military with more compensation, more veterans kinds of benefits, and so they're reasonably well cared for in that regard. Now, is there problems with veterans' health? Yes, there's problems with veterans' health. And could they make more money if they went to Goldman Sachs? Yes, they do. But they, compared to their counterparts in American history, 240 years or whatever of counterparts, compared to the folks at Valley Forge, they're well cared for right now. And the problem is that the country has made promises to them that in the decades to come will be exceedingly hard to honor. And the current leadership of the military, the 4 stars who are running it, are concerned that pay and compensation and health care and benefits is going to consume all of the defense budget in the out years, 20 years, 30 years out. And this is a big concern.
Consume all of the budget, period.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's let's play on a broader field now. So you just wrote a nice contrarian piece about the incoming national security advisor. So in my tribe, in my network, the general feeling can be summarized by "we're all going to die." And you said, basically, give them a chance.
So that was the headline that the editors put on this. That's not
Because the article wasn't quite so...
yeah, the headline I put on it was, "Are there silver linings?" So I sat down and said, everybody else is writing that, we're all going to die.
Yep.
And in fact, our friend Colin Cowell wrote basically that, we're all going to die. And so is there more to the story? And I identified some things that were, silver linings. Some of them were admittedly pretty small things, and I likened them to praising the popcorn in the concession stand at the Ford Theater in April 1865. Why are you talking about this when this is where the real action is? But I thought that the president handled the firing of McMaster more adroitly than he handled the firing of Tillerson just a couple weeks earlier. I thought he did it the right way. If you're going to fire someone, do it the way he did it with McMaster rather than the way he did with Tillerson. I like that the president didn't make Bolton shave his mustache, which is...
We're talking about the big issue.
I know.
Well, yeah.
Well, but the president had apparently made looks a really important criteria for office, and that that's not a problem for you because you're a handsome guy, but people like me and others, we never get a chance. And there's a lot of capable people who don't look like they should have the job, and so that I'm glad that I hope that's a sign the president is going to use other criteria. More seriously, he's competent. He is a very capable bureaucratic player. He's much better experienced at the interagency than H.R. McMaster was, vastly more capable than Mike Flynn was. So at the level of executing interagency operations, I think Bolton has the experience and the intelligence and the craftsmanship to pull that off. And I love that his first name is not General or Admiral. So I'm a big fan of H.R. McMaster. I wish he had retired before he took that post. I think he would have been more capable as a retired three-star than as a serving three-star. But I also wanted senior civilians in these civilian political pots to beef up civilian control, the bedrock principle. And so Bolton does that. So these are all things. And then I even sketched a scenario that says maybe you could get a good cop, bad cop in the North Korean negotiations that appear to be coming. Bolton is a tough, sets a very high standard for a deal. And if Bolton says we've got a deal, I think he'll persuade a lot of other people that this deal is good. And he will help play bad cop to Trump's possible good cop of eager for any kind of deal, and thus more likely to, if there is a deal to be had with North Korea, more likely to find it. That's the good news. The bad news is, if there is no deal to be had with North Korea, then Bolton's going to find that out faster than other pairings of staff. And so if there's no diplomatic deal to be had with North Korea, we're going to reach the point of crisis much faster, I think, and that's a sobering thought.
So you don't think he would buy into the scenario that some are drawing that Trump and Kim meet, they produce a paper, one piece of paper that says, we have agreed to work jointly for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and we're tasking our underlings to make this all happen in a period of 3 to 5 years or something like that. And then everyone says, oh, well, that's certainly better than what we had last week.
That's the rosy scenario outcome of the path we're on. And it's possible. And I think I don't know Bolton well enough to know whether he would accept that as a better outcome than some other, what he would deem to be worse outcomes, where the president actually made huge concessions,
Right.
and we're going to...
Our troops are out of here.
Our troops are out of here, things like that a President Trump, desperate for a legacy-making deal, might offer a concession like that, and then that would actually make the situation on the peninsula worse. Bolton is a hedge against that. I think Bolton might take that, and then those 3 to 5 years would be grueling arms control negotiations. Bolton is a very grueling taskmaster on negotiations. But the point is, if those negotiations are going to fail, because there is no overlap between what we can accept and what North Korea can accept, if that's the underlying diplomatic reality, we will find that out sooner rather than later, is my concern.
Do you agree with the conclusion that the appointment of John Bolton is the last nail in the coffin of the Iran nuclear deal?
I think so, because it's not just Bolton, but remember, you had Tillerson and McMaster and Mattis all arguing that the president was stuck with the JCPOA. And now 2 of those people are gone. And one of they're replaced by 2 people who have been much more open to the idea of withdrawing from JCPOA. That's how I describe Pompeo, and adamant that we must, which is how I describe Bolton's position. And that's much closer to the president's instincts. As you know, the president, well, he's told us that he hates
the worst deal ever.
He hated recertifying the deal the last 2 times that he did it, and so I do think it's the final nail in the coffin. The Hail Mary is for Brian Hook to deliver European concessions on...
Brian Hook is the Director of Policy Planning.
Director of Policy Planning. He's the lead negotiator with the Europeans on ratcheting up the pressure on Iran on the nefarious activities that Iran's involved in that were not covered in the JCPOA. And if he gets significant pressure from the Europeans on Iran on these other dimensions in exchange for another extension or 2 of the JCPOA, if the pressure on Iran is high enough from the Europeans, that is a deal that might give the JCPOA a longer lease on life. I think that kind of deal with Tillerson and McMaster would have been enough. I think they could have persuaded the president. Would it be a good enough deal that it would convince Bolton to, also back it? It's harder to say. But the irony here is that I think their critique of the JCPOA has a lot of merit. That is, I don't think it was as good a deal as President Obama said it was. I have a lot of respect for Wendy Sherman, who negotiated it. So it's not a critique of the team that negotiated it, but there was some of the critique that it left off nefarious activities that Iran was allowed to continue. That's correct. And if you talk to Jake Sullivan or Wendy Sherman about it, they say, well, we intended to also maintain the pressure on Iran on these other dimensions. But it was hard to maintain the pressure on these other dimensions for fear of wrecking the opening to Iran that the JCPOA produced. And so there was, I think some of the critique of the deal is right. But if you take that critique seriously, then you realize, wait a second, another claim of our critique, our being the Republican critique, is we front-loaded the benefits to Iran and back-loaded the benefits to us. We made concessions up front, and then the benefits to us are later on. And if that's the case, then you don't want to break with the JCPOA. This is why I think...
This is the George Shultz argument.
Yes, we should stay in the JCPOA because we already paid for it. And so you may say we overpaid for it. Okay, but we did. Let's at least get the benefits. Like a timeshare. You spent way too much. Well, the last thing you want to do after having spent way too much is not use the timeshare. Use the timeshare. And then maintain pressure. So I liked where we seem to have been going with the Hook negotiations, and I thought, oh, maybe they'll rescue this. That looks more problematic now.
Last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. As a never Trumper, which you were or are, what do you think when you read articles like the one that just appeared in the Washington Post about how Trump has made the Republican Party his party, and how do you think about the future of your tribe?
Right. So I signed all of the letters critiquing the famous ones, the ones in March of 2016. I organized another one right after that, and I signed the one in August. And I wrote lots and lots of screeds. So I opposed President Trump during the campaign. On election day, though, the electorate made him my president. And so he became my president on election day. And at that point, I was no longer a never Trumper. So in fact, at the time that I wrote I signed the first letter, I wrote a piece co-authored with Mitchell Reese where we dissected what does signing this letter mean you would never ever help President Trump, and we laid out the logic of why the letter was promising that we would not vote for him, but if he became president, at that point you don't want to root for him to fail. At least I didn't want to. And so on election day, that group of people who had opposed the president had an internal debate, started an internal debate. What now? We didn't expect it. Most of us thought it would be President Clinton for another 4 years. But he became the president. And my argument was this. I had said, I don't think he should fly the plane. That's what I was saying during the campaign. But he's flying the plane, and I'm in the plane. So at this point, I don't want to be sitting in coach shooting spitballs at him and calling him names because it feels good. I want to do what I can to help him and his team fly the plane so it doesn't crash. And since that point, I've done what I can to help the administration where I can. Now, because I've signed all the letters, I'm not in danger of being offered a job. So there's no danger of me being put in a difficult position like that. But I certainly have wanted him to get better policies rather than worse policies. And where they have had good policies, I've tried to acknowledge that. Where they've had bad policies, I've tried to acknowledge that in a way that would lead to better policies. So I've approached it in a more open-handed way, not open-handed, but in a more open-armed way than some of my other friends who have been, lockstep in the resistance. But I do worry about the Republican brand. So for most of my professional life, the voters had higher confidence in Republicans when they were worried about national security. They had higher confidence in Democrats when they worried about domestic policy. But if there was a war or national security was a concern, there was a rally to Republicans. And that was because Republicans had a brand of responsible, hard, defend America, national security policies. I worry that Republicans are losing that brand. And I worry that the issue that bothers me the most on this, and if you wanted to really make me miserable, you could have asked me about this, but I'll ask myself about it anyway. How so many Republican voters in opinion polls could express a cavalier attitude towards what Russia did to us in the 2016. Because I was enjoying bashing Obama for being soft-headed about Russia, and I was making hay for 4 years on that issue, and I thought I had the Republican Party behind me while I did it. And I turn around now, and many voters in opinion polls are making apologies or saying they don't think the Russians did it, or expressing that, well, Putin makes the trains run on time, or whatever it is. That's deeply disturbing. And so I worried about the Republican brand there. And I was part of the Republican community that thought American values are part of what makes America great is that our founders tapped into ideas that have universal appeal, and that it's not that anyone can become an American. It's not a tribal thing. It's not a race thing. It's not an ethnicity. It's an idea thing. And if you recognize the value of American ideals, you can become an American. And by the way, these ideals are pretty good. And other people would benefit from it. That sort of Reagan-esque, George Shultz-esque, President Bush, 43, the one I served for, at his best, articulated these well. And I worry that in opinion polls, so many Republican voters express doubt about American values and their appeal more broadly. And they take a more parochial, this is what works inside but doesn't work broader. So those two issues I do really worry about.
Please wait for the mic. Anyone have a question? How about right here, and then we'll get another mic over there.
Thank you for the microphone. I have so many questions. Thank you. It's a great overview of this point of view, and you two of you up front obviously have depth of experience. It helps many of us. What do you think will be the fate of our pussy-probing Putin puppet president, if I might use some alliteration and tell you my political point of view? You reflect the Republican point of view about accepting a president and who's, as a party that has no moral grounding at the present time, I don't see much moral grounding in our president. What do you think his fate will be?
Well, I do think he'll be primaried. I think that there will be serious candidates who run against him in the primary. We already know that he'll be primaried from the Never Trumper wing. So whether it's Jeff Flake or John Kasich or someone like that who's already been vocally opposed to the president will run against him. I think he will. Barring other shoes dropping, I think, if you were to bet today, President Trump could beat that threat in the primaries. A more ominous threat for Trump's political future would be a primary threat from within, someone who could credibly say, I was with President Trump and wanted him to work. The problem is that President Trump tweets too much and didn't have self-control and had personal baggage. His ideas were good, but his personal self-control was not. And someone who could credibly occupy that space, so they had not been a dead set against President Trump, but could give you Trump without the tweeting, that person, I think, is a more serious primary threat to the president. And would anyone like that emerge? Well, no, not maybe March 2018, it doesn't look that way, but what if Democrats get one of the chambers and then the oversight of the president ratchets up dramatically and also the political paralysis extends? In that moment, you might get, and let's say Mueller's investigation turns up some things and turns up the heat. In that setting, you might get him primaried from within his base. And then I think he would have a tough row to hoe to get elected. He might still win the nomination, but then he'd be very vulnerable in the general. I realize because talking about Republican problems is so obviously the thing to do, it causes us to miss the dumpster fire that is the Democratic Party. And if it weren't for President Trump,
I take it that's me.
Yeah, the dumpster fire that is sitting to my right. No, I think the Democratic Party is in a identity crisis, extreme identity crisis, and really struggling to what do they stand for, and they're rapidly shedding lots of things that they used to stand for and are not acting in. And actually, if I'll take advantage of Dan here, Dan's wing of the Democratic Party, a more hawkish for a Democrat muscular approach to foreign policy that was I think Secretary Clinton's wing is in retreat, and the Sanders and the Warren wing is in the ascendancy. And the Democrats could well nominate an unelectable candidate, and then by default, President Trump could win. So it could happen that way. Or the Democrats could nominate someone like The Rock, and that would make for an interesting. I think he might actually win. I think he would be a formidable challenger to President Trump. So I think 2020 is a big jump ball. That was a long-winded answer to say I don't know. Yeah. And if I had known, I would have. I wouldn't have been so wrong for the last 3 years in predicting what was going to happen.
Thank you. Next question. You want to just throw it, or?
Or there
it is. Great.
Funding because of the sequester. How do you square that with the fact that we spend such a high percentage of our GDP on the military? Can you say a few things
Yes.
on those lines?
Yeah, we don't spend a high percentage of our GDP. We spend a lot of money, and we spend the most by far of any great power, or any power, on defense. But if you say as a percentage of GDP, our Cold War average was 2 to 3 times what our current burden is. If percentage of GDP is a rough and ready measure of the burden, can we afford this? We are at historically meaning since World War II, low levels of percentage of GDP. So I think it's manageable from a burden point of view. The issue fiscally is that it's a huge percentage and a growing percentage of the discretionary part of the budget. That is the non-entitlement spending of the government. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are entitlements that you can't play with on an annual appropriations basis. If you look at the budget that you can, quote unquote, play with on an annual basis, the military is by far and away the largest chunk of that. And so there it looks quite burdensome from the point of view of the opportunity cost. What else could we be spending this money on? And there's a moment in the Obama administration when the Defense Department was telling the president what Afghanistan was going to cost over the next, 5 years or something like that. And the president said, I just spent the morning trying to find a couple $2 billion for early childhood education, and we could not find it in the budget. So now, tell me how you're going to spend 100 times that on Afghanistan. I mean, just use that to frame the discussion. Those opportunity costs, defense spending is high, but as a percentage of GDP, it's not too high, and it's manageable. Of course, you probably need tax reform to balance the budget, and so that's a different fiscal issue. But I think we can afford the amount that Congress and the president have allocated to defense. I think that's a sustainable amount. I also think, though, politically, it's just going to be a single blip and it's going to go back down. Because I think if Democrats win one of the chambers or both of the chambers, they will not sustain the defense spending at the level that it's projected.
Any other questions?
Oh,
Can you wait for the mic?
Percentage difference between personnel and armaments. I mean, in our local budget, for example, that we're just passing, like 80% of our town budget is personnel, and I wondered how that compares to what's happening in the military. Because we always hear about the, multi-billion-dollar single plane, but what is the reality there?
Yeah, so the U.S. defense spending has lots of problems with it, but the two biggest problems are that the pay and benefits, the cost per person, very high and growing higher over time as you look at the future entitlements. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the per unit cost of our weapons is extremely high and growing higher. So you put those two factors together, you have less of percentage available to spend on armaments, and then each individual armament is so expensive, you're buying fewer of them, and so you're losing economies of scale. And so this is an area, acquisition reform, that is way overdue for reform. And it's one of the bright spots of this administration. I think the Mattis, Shanahan team is poised to grasp that nettle of acquisition reform and make progress there where the last 10, 15 years we haven't been able to make progress. So if you're looking for something to be optimistic about, I think they might actually achieve some reform on that question of spending DoD dollars more efficiently, efficaciously. That's my hope.
You had a question, right? Be our last question.
So both with the first half of your talk about the societal concerns and the second half about policy, my sort of gut impression, and this may be just because I am more sentient perhaps than I've been in past administrations because I'm older, is that like we're running out of qualified people who are willing to do things, both on your societal side, people who are willing to join the military and are excited about that, and on the policy side, people who are qualified and represent a range of backgrounds and ideas, and who are willing to work in the administration, specifically the executive branch. And I wonder if you can speak to the idea of like scarcity. We in my mental picture, we used to have draw from a wider, more diverse pool of people to join the military, and now we have kind of an ideological, a geographic insularity, and on the policy side, regardless of whether you want to have more hawkish policy or more kind of diplomacy-centered policy, the fact is that I haven't seen us adding anyone who's interested in diplomacy, Like everyone who's now joining the administration, and there's a lot of turnover, is in the more hawkish camp. Yeah.
So in some ways, particularly the first concern you have, it's worse than that. This is, my colleagues on the Bush administration said that's what they're going to put on my tombstone. It's worse than that, because that was what I said in every policy meeting. So the civ mil gap question is the percentage of people your age who are qualified to join the military, who are acceptable to the military, is shrinking. It's in the mid-20s now. That the vast majority of the demographic slice that you would recruit into the military is not fit enough, physically fit, is on mind-altering substance, Ritalin, things like that would make them not eligible. Some of them could be changed by policy, like have tattoos and things. So we might have to just bend the rules on that. But are felons or couldn't pass the literacy test. So just the eligible pool is shrinking, and that's a concern. Now, it's true, the size of what we need is shrinking as well. We have a smaller but more lethal military today. And so the military is still able to meet their accession requirements. But it is a concern. And it's a diversity concern. It's why I want ROTC to stay on elite campuses like Dartmouth and others, so that you're broadening the pool of people from which you draw. And you're broadening the pool. I'm less concerned about Dartmouth people going into the military. I'm more interested in the roommates of the Dartmouth people who go into the military and who then end up on the NSC staff, but they at least know somebody. They roomed with somebody who has skin in the game, so it changes, I think, their calculation. So yes, there is some concern on the accession side. I worry more that your generation doubts that government service is efficacious, and maybe even doubts that it's noble. So there's polls that show your generation is very public-minded, cares a lot about global problems, but would rather start your own NGO with your name in it, maybe, to address this problem. Not you personally, but the students I see anyway. But rather than joining government, and they think government, that's not where you go to get things done. And that's a problem. We need high caliber people going into government. And I worry very much about the human capital development problem that State Department has bought for themselves with the morale crisis, with senior leaders leaving, so the mentors of the junior FSOs are leaving, with the deep cuts and cutting some of the scholarship programs and things like that. These are things to worry about and to fix. I think they're fixable. I think Pompeo will fix some of them. I'm bullish. I also don't accept your definition that if you're a hawk, you're opposed to diplomacy. I think Pompeo, I think, wants vigorous, muscular diplomacy, and I think he will be capable at it. So there's a reason to hope. But you should worry about the human capital dimension of it, and you should tell yourself and your friends, check out government service. It's noble. We need the best and brightest. And get involved in the War and Peace program here, if you're not already, because it's a remarkable opportunity for you to get, begin that process of networking and getting a job in DC. So yes, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. But your generation can address it.
Professor Kerry.
I didn't realize how late it is. You want to wrap up?
No, go ahead. What's another 10 minutes?
I apologize. I'll be quick. I'm curious, thinking about projection of U.S. military force into theaters that, like Yemen, Syria, various countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the debate sounds like first of all, in the insider circles that you're traveling in, about what the boundaries on that ought to be, and then also if you can kind of speculate about what a public debate on that might sound like. I don't think it's going to happen in the context of a midterm election, but you had talked a little bit about looking behind you, and the Republican Party that you knew for much of your career is not there anymore. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the partisan dimensions of that and how you might think it would look going forward.
So the short answer is, I think on that narrow question, which is not how to deal with Russia, how to deal with China, and it's not really how to deal with Syria, which is a different one. But on that narrow question of how to prosecute the war on terror and to maintain pressure on militant Islamist networks that are wanting to do us wrong. So in his world, I think Obama finally got to the right answer. It was a little late and $1 short, but the sustainable levels of op tempo that was not so burdensome that it triggered the anti-war movement, but was not so little that it allowed zones of power vacuums in which more lethal forms of these terrorist groups could form. Maintaining that ops tempo going forward, I think that's the right answer given where we were in 2016. We could argue about we shouldn't have been where we were in 2016 because of decisions that were made by Obama and by Bush, but that's where we were, and by Clinton for that matter, but that's where we were in 2016 going forward. And what's interesting is the Clinton people, I'm pretty sure if they had won, they would have maintained that, is my sense. The Trump people have a real debate about it. The Mattis wing thinks that's how you do it. The Bannon wing that sounds like perpetual war. And they were opposed to it. And the sort of the Rand Paul wing says, wait a second, that's militarism. We don't need to be engaged in it. And so there was not a consensus within the Republican elites that mattered for the Trump administration on what to do. Over time, the mattis wing has prevailed. And they've maintained the Obama ops tempo with more permissive rules of engagement.
And a lot more ordnance.
And a lot more ordnance. And it's had the effect of increasing civilian casualties, and so the pressure is on them to ratchet it back, and they probably will if Democrats win one of the chambers, and so the oversight looks a little different. But I think that's the least worst alternative for waging the global war on terror, given that we are where we are. And so I'm sorry, on record, Hal Brands and I wrote, a piece on that makes this argument in the last 2 years, and I think that's where we are.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Peter, for being with us today. It was a lot of fun.